start reading the story of Nelson Mandela. Chapter 1, A Leader is Born. Meet Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was born into a royal family of the Thambu people in South Africa. His father, the loyal chief and advisor to the king, gave him the name of Kolihilahila. In his native language of Xhosa, the name means pulling the branch of a tree, but the more common meanings is troublemaker. Nelson grew up to be a troublemaker in the best way. He made good trouble by fighting against unfair laws. When Nelson was a boy, however, few people would have guessed his future. South Africa is a country located at the southern tip of the continent of Africa. It has beautiful mountains, valleys, deserts, and forests. The country is also rich in natural resources like gold and diamonds. When European settlers came to South Africa in search of these treasures, over time they took over the country. The white settlers started separating black and white people and made laws that restricted black people's rights. Nelson dedicated his life to fighting against these unjust laws. The government arrested him and many others for standing up for what they believed in, equal rights for all people. But Nelson never gave up. He went on to be the first black president of Africa. He went on to become the first black president of South Africa. He inspired people from around the world and became a symbol of peace and justice. He changed South Africa and the world forever with his work and words. Nelson, South Africa. Nelson was born in South Africa on July 18th in 1918. Long before he was born, black kings and queens ruled the area. Over hundreds of years, the Dutch, British, and others came to colonize or take over parts of South Africa. Then, in the late 1800s, something happened that changed South Africa forever. Gold and diamonds were found in the land. No one had known that South Africa had such riches. White Europeans seeking fortune flooded the country. When they brought powerful weapons with them, they also brought new diseases. The Africans' immune systems had no defense against these diseases. Many people died. Myth and fact. Myth. White people controlled South Africa because they were more white people than black people in the country. Fact. White people controlled South Africa because they had more advanced weapons and brought disease to the country, which let them gain more power. Over time, these colonists gained more and more control over the country. Black South Africans were sold into slavery and shipped to Europe and America. The ones who stayed were robbed of their land, animals, and jobs. Even though there were many more black people than white people, whites had almost all the power. Whites made laws about where black people could live and go to school. South African men had to leave their families to work in the gold and diamond mines. People were unhappy and afraid. It was the perfect time for an inspiring leader to rise up. Chapter 2, The Early Years. Growing up. Nelson was born in a mud hut in a tiny village of Mvezu. His father, Gada, was a chief of the Thambu royal family. In their religion, men could have more than one wife. Nelson's mother, Nose Kenny, was one of his father's 4 wives. When Nelson was still a baby, his father got in trouble for standing up to an unfair British judge. The judge took away his position as chief. He also took away most of his money, land, and animals. The family could no longer afford to live in Mvezu. Nelson's mother took him and his 3 little sisters to live with her family in the nearby village of Kunu. In Kunu, Families lived in small huts shaped like beehives. The huts had mud walls and a wooden pole through the middle to hold up the grass roofs. Nelson had a happy life in Kunu. He learned how to herd sheep and cattle by the time he was 5 years old. He and the other children made their own toys, hunted small animals, and practiced fighting with sticks. Nelson loved being outdoors. When Nelson was 7, his mother sent him to school run by Christian teachers. He was the first person in his family to go to school. His family had no money for new clothes. Like other children in his village, Nelson wore a blanket dyed with red clay most days. His father cut off a pair of his own pants at the knee, so they were short enough for Nelson. Nelson proudly walked to school in his new pants. He was given the name Nelson the same day at the time. It was the tradition that Christian teachers would give students English names. Great place. Sadly, Nelson's father died when Nelson was 12 years old. Nelson's mother was forced to make a difficult decision. She sent Nelson to live with his uncle, Chief John Gintaba. Okay. His mother knew that the chief could take better care of him. Nelson's heart sank as he walked away from Kunu and all the happy memories he had made there. The chief's home was called the Great Place. It was made up of several buildings surrounded by gardens and fruit trees. Nelson had never seen anything so grand. He felt like he was entering a magical kingdom. The chief and his wife welcomed Nelson into their lives. They sent him to school and treated him the same as their own son, Justice. Justice was 4 years older than Nelson. The two boys became close friends. Sometimes the chief allowed them to race horses. On some nights, Nelson and the other boys would dance while girls sang and clapped. Nelson missed his mother, but he was happy with his new life. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Nelson learned a lot about leadership while living at the Great Place. As his uncle was preparing him to become a royal advisor, Chief John Gintaba let him come to meetings he held with Thambu elders. Nelson would join the men as they gathered around. Chief John Gintaba let him come to meetings he held with the Thambu elders. Nelson would join the men as they gathered around the fireplace. He watched how his uncle treated people who came by him with problems. His uncle would listen to everyone before he made a decision. Every person at the meeting had a voice. These lessons stayed with Nelson for the rest of his life. Chapter 3. Becoming Political. Fort Hare. Nelson studied hard as he grew up. He believed that education was his key to a successful life. In 1939, he arrived at the University College of Fort Hare. It was the only all-black college in South Africa. Only the best students were accepted. At Fort Hare, he met a student named Oliver Tambo. The two became lifelong friends. Years later, they also became law partners. Nelson started to compete in soccer, running, and boxing. He practiced ballroom dancing. He even acted in a play. He also became interested in politics. He hoped to work for the government after college. This would be an important job. He would be able to buy a new house for his mother and make her life easier. In his second year of college, he was nominated for student government. The students wanted better food. They also wanted a stronger voice in school policies. The school refused to do what they asked. Nelson quit the student government in protest, like his father had when he stood up to the unfair judge. Nelson paid a price for standing up for his beliefs. He was expelled from Fort Hare. Nelson was upset to be kicked out. He worried he was throwing away his dreams, but he also felt proud that he had stood by other students. Chief John Gintaba was angry and disappointed. When Nelson left college, the chief was very sick. He was worried about what would happen to Nelson and Justice in the future. He chose brides for the two young men and told them, "You must get married right away." Neither Nelson nor Justice was ready for marriage. They ran away to Johannesburg, the biggest city in Africa. Justice soon went back, but Nelson convinced the chief to let him stay. He was ready for an independent life. Life in Johannesburg was a whole new world for Nelson. He rented a room in the Alexandria Township, a very poor neighborhood that was sometimes called Dark City because it didn't have electricity. This was because the white city managers would not let Alexandra collect taxes to manage the area. Nelson soon saw that life in the city was very bad for black people. They mostly worked in the gold and diamond mines, which were low-paying jobs. Whites held all the good jobs. They ran the government and were getting rich for owning the mines. And black people were not allowed to move freely through the city. They were forced to live in areas like Alexandria, which didn't have any of the resources that white parts of the city did. Nelson quit student government. In Johannesburg, Nelson met a businessman named Walter Sisulu. The two men were instantly impressed with each other. Nelson admired how well Walter spoke English. Walter thought Nelson was a born leader. He helped Nelson get a job as a law clerk. This was a big break for Nelson. White law firms did not usually hire black clerks. Nelson also took college classes by mail. He worked during the day and studied at night. In 1942, Nelson earned his bachelor's degree from the University of South Africa. Shortly after graduation, Walter introduced Nelson to his cousin, Evanly Mace. Nelson immediately asked her on a date. The two quickly fell in love. Before long, they were married. Myth and fact. Myth. Everyone could live anywhere they wanted in Johannesburg. Fact. Black people were forced to live in poor, dirty parts of the city that didn't get the same resources white areas did. In 1942, Nelson joined the African National Congress, or ANC. The ANC worked for equal rights for the black South Africans. Their meetings were filled with lively debate about issues affecting black people. Nelson was inspired by their passion. However, he and other young men in the ANC started to feel that things weren't changing fast enough. In 1944, they started the ANC Youth League. Nelson had become a true activist. Chapter 4. Civil Rights Activist. Apartheid. Nelson and Evelyn had 4 children. Sadly, one daughter died when she was only a baby. Nelson loved spending time with his family. He loved playing with his children, reading to them at bedtime, and relaxing at home. But Nelson also deeply cared about what was happening in the country. His work often took him away from his family. When the all-white National Party was voted into power in 1948, they began a policy called apartheid. Apartheid means apartness in the Afrikaans language. The National Party believed blacks were inferior to whites. They passed cruel laws to keep them in power. Black people couldn't vote. People of different races couldn't get married, ride on buses together, or even live in the same neighborhood. Perhaps worst of all, black people had to carry passbooks at all times. Passbooks had a person's name and picture, and also information such as where they were allowed to work and travel. If a black person was caught without a passbook, they could be arrested. After seeing the terrible things the government stood for, Nelson knew he would never work for it. Like he planned in 1952, he and Oliver Tambo opened the first black law firm in South Africa. They represented black people arrested under the new apartheid laws. A few firms would take black clients, so lots of people came to their office. Oliver usually worked in the office while Nelson went to court. He would ignore the rules of apartheid, walking boldly through the whites-only door at the courthouse. He became a powerful figure in the fight for equality. People came to court just to watch him in action. Protest. In 1952, the NAC decided to take their biggest action yet. They would refuse to follow the apartheid laws, even if it meant they had to go to jail. More than 8,500 people joined the cause, holding peaceful protests all over the country. These protests were small but powerful. Protesters entered train cars and restrooms marked whites only. They stayed out past curfew. They marched together while singing freedom songs. This series of protests was called the Defiance Company. The ANC had told people not to use violence no matter what happened. Protesters knew they might be hurt, but they kept their word. Many, including Nelson, were arrested and beaten. People in government started to see Nelson as a troublemaker, just like his birth name said. Soon, he was banned from making public speeches. He was not allowed to write for newspapers. He couldn't even leave his neighborhood. Nelson still refused to back down, and he and other activists started working on a Bill of Rights called the Freedom Charter. They wanted fairness and equality for all South Africans. This was the first time that people or different races worked together in South Africa. On June 25th and 26th of 1955, more than 3,000 people from all over the country gathered on a soccer field in Kliptown. This gathering was called the Congress of the People. People cheered wildly and shouted "Africa" as the charter was read, but then the police arrived. The Congress of the People came to an end, but Nelson and the NAC and the ANC were more determined than ever. We are not in opposition to any government or class of people. We are opposing a system which has for years kept a vast section of the non-European people in bondage. Chapter 5. Fighting for Justice. Treason Trial Years. In the early morning of December 5th, 1956, Nelson awoke to loud pounding on his door. The police had come to arrest him and charge him with the high treason. Nelson and 155 other activists were taken to jail. Conditions were dismissal with bare concrete cells and thin blankets, but the men were cheered by news from around the world. People were protesting for them. There were also huge crowds rooting for them. When they were taken to court, they walked through the doors with their fists held high. The trial lasted for more than 4 years. Finally, all charges against Nelson and the others were dropped. Nelson did not have to stay in jail during the trial. He was allowed to go home after 2 weeks. When Nelson entered his house, he found it empty. His wife, Evelyn, had left him. Nelson had known she had not agreed to work with the ANC. She did not like that he had spent so many hours away from family. He spent so many hours away from the family. Even so, Nelson was sad and surprised that she had left. What was once a house full of laughing children was now empty and quiet. In 1957, Nelson saw a beautiful woman at a bus stop. Weeks later, she came into his office for legal help. Her name was Winnie. Nelson fell in love with the moment he met her. Winnie was one of the first black social workers in South Africa. She was smart and passionate about politics and the ANC. Nelson and Winnie got married a year later and had 2 daughters together. Winnie stood by Nelson during his trial. As a couple, they worked together to end apartheid, going underground. On March 21st, 1960, a crowd of 10,000 people met at the police station in the township of Sharpeville to protest passbooks. Without warning, the police fired guns into the crowd. They killed 69 unarmed black South Africans. Another 180, including 19 children, were badly hurt. People around the world were horrified when they learned what had happened. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones. The Sharpeville massacre changed how Nelson thought about ending apartheid. He no longer felt that peaceful protests would be enough. He helped start a group called Spear of the Nation. The group did not want to hurt anyone. They wanted to get people's attention by disrupting the country. Their plan was to set off homemade bombs at power plants and government office, but when people were not in the buildings. After Sharpeville, the government declared a state of emergency. People were not allowed to gather in public. The police could arrest and hold anyone, even without proof of a crime. Nelson and others burned their passbooks in protest. The police raided Nelson's home and arrested him, leaving Winnie, who was pregnant, by herself. After Nelson was released from jail, the police watched his house day and night. It was no longer safe for him there. He was forced to leave his family and go into hiding. He hid at various safe houses and even traveled outside the country to gather more support for the ANC. While in South Africa, Nelson was often wore disguises to hide from the police. He let his hair and beard grow long, and he would dress as a chief or a driver or as a field worker. He narrowly escaped many times. Finally, on August 5th, 1962, the police caught up with him. He was dressed as a driver, but the police hadn't known he was coming, and by the time, they were not fooled. Chapter 6. Prison Years. Robben Island. Nelson was put on trial again. In April 1964, he gave a 3-hour speech in court, spreading his message about the unfairness of apartheid. He did not deny that he had broken laws, but he explained why he had done so. The courthouse was silent, but as he spoke, some people were brought to tears. 2 months later, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. In June 1964, Nelson was sent to Robben Island prison. It was damp and horribly cold on the island. The prisoners were dressed in short pants and shoes without socks. Nelson's jail cell was 8 feet by 7 feet, with a mat on the floor for sleeping. He was given a bucket to use as a toilet while he was in prison. Nelson had very little contact with the outside world. He was allowed only 2 visitors and could only write 2 letters per year. Prisoners were not allowed to read newspapers, but sometimes guards would give them news, especially news that would upset them. Nelson learned that his wife, Winnie, had been arrested from a newspaper clipping left by a guard. Nelson tried to make the best of his time in prison. He read and studied as often as he could. He exercised every morning, running in place and doing push-ups in his jail cell. He and other prisoners found creative ways to talk to each other. They hid notes under piles of dirty dishes or inside old matchbooks. Nelson even found a way to write. He secretly wrote much of his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, during those lonely years. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. Free Mandela. Outside of the prison, black South Africans continued to struggle against apartheid. The unrest that spread across the country couldn't be bottled up again. Oliver Tambo refused to let people forget Nelson. In 1980, he started the Free Nelson Mandela campaign. Mayors from 20,000 cities on every continent signed a document demanding Nelson's freedom. Even though he was out of sight, Nelson was still the face of the anti-apartheid movement. In 1982, after 2 years on Robben Island, Nelson was moved to Pollsmoor Prison. At Pollsmoor, prisoners had real beds and toilets and even better meals. Even though he was more comfortable, Nelson wondered why he had been moved. He thought the government might be trying to take away his power by splitting up from his friends. In 1985, the South African Prime Minister, P.W. Botha, ordered Nelson a deal. He would release Nelson from prison if Nelson said it was wrong to use violence in protest. Nelson did not accept. Instead, he secretly wrote a speech about the offer he had tried peaceful protest, but it had been met with violence. He wrote that even if he were freed from prison, he could not be free in a country where he could not vote. His daughter Zindzi read the inspiring speech to a packed stadium. The crowd cheered when she finished. F.W. de Klerk became president of South Africa in 1989. He believed that the apartheid needed to end. He started to make changes like lifting the ban on the ANC. He also made another big decision to free Nelson Mandela. On February 11, 1990, after 27 years behind bars, Nelson left prison as a free man at the age of 71. He and Winnie walked through the prison gate together. They were greeted by a huge crowd celebrating Nelson's release. Honor belongs to those who never forsake the truth, even when things seem dark and grim. Chapter 7. World Leader. President Mandela. Nelson quickly got back to work with the ANC. He wanted the world to see that his time in prison had not taken away his spirit or his drive for change. The country was still very divided. Many white people still believed in apartheid. Many black people felt that things were changing too slowly. Nelson and the ANC often met with President de Klerk and others in the government. In 1992, they signed a record of understanding. This agreement laid out a plan to transition a new government. In 1993, Nelson and President de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in bringing this country together. In late 1994, Nelson ran against. In late April 1994, Nelson ran against President de Klerk in South Africa's first democratic election. For the first time, South Africans of every race could vote. The country was alive with hope and excitement. People stood in line for hours, patiently waiting to vote. When all the votes were continued, the ANC party won with 62% of the vote. Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. When Nelson was sworn in, 1 billion people around the world watched on television. Was the president of South Africa. When Nelson was sworn in, 1 billion people around the world watched on television. As its president, Nelson followed the example he had learned from Chief John Gintaba. He listened to all parties and found things most people could agree on. He worked with the different groups to create a new constitution, which was adopted in 1922. Nelson believed that forgiveness was the way forward to South Africa, and he spread this message the people. He even forgave those who had put him in prison for all those years. Madiba. Nelson decided to serve one term as president. He believed it was time for a younger person to lead, so he stepped down from June 1990 in 2005. Nelson's son, Magathu, died of AIDS, a disease that attacks the immune system. Nelson then committed himself to teaching South Africans about this disease. His work helped save millions of lives. Nelson also finally had time to do things he had missed while in prison. He and Winnie had divorced, and he had married Garza Machel, a children's rights activist. In 1998, together with Graça, he spent holidays, birthdays, graduations, and weddings with his family. Myth and fact. Myth. All South Africans loved and agreed with Nelson Mandela. Fact. Some thought he should have done more for black South Africans and to punish whites who killed people and took land away. Today, when South Africans think of Nelson, they use the word Madiba. The term is an Idiomate that means father. In 2009, the United Nations declared Nelson's birthday, July 18th, as Nelson Mandela International Day, a day meant for volunteering and community service. A winner is a dreamer who never gives up. The world mourned when Nelson Mandela passed away on December 5th, 2013, at the age of 95. His vision of a peaceful and fair world with equality for all lives through his legacy. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this book, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!